I think we should back up a little bit
Hmm.
and kind of turn toward, okay, you've gone through undergraduate, you've done relatively well, you're thinking, okay, I want to pursue postgraduate, I want to pursue master's, PhD program in philosophy. At the moment, I'm hell bent on going into academia, but they're kind of like there's all these programs out there, there's all these options, master's, PhD, there's different places to go. What do I do?
Hmm.
When do I do it? You know, where in the process do I take time off and then do it? Am I better off rushing to do it? I think there's a lot of those questions that people have um, when they undertake an undergraduate degree. So I'm wondering for you guys who have gone through that process, I guess the first question is the when, right? Like when should students, or is there a best time for students to start thinking about I'm going to apply to postgraduate programs? Should it be right after
Hmm.
undergraduate? Should it be during, or should they take some time based on your guys' experience?
Well, I think one important thing to keep in mind is that it's just prudent to do as well as one possibly can as an undergraduate and get the best possible credentials you can as an undergraduate, irrespective of whether you ultimately decide to pursue postgraduate study or not. Um, if you're thinking about moving into postgraduate study immediately after undergrad, then I think the question of how to prepare for that and how to put yourself in a position to do that successfully should probably be on your mind. I would say about 18 months or 2 years, sort of from the time you'll be leaving your program. So here in Edinburgh, that would mean sort of in year three. Um, but of course, you may end up, coming to the end of your undergraduate years and decide you don't want to do that. But hopefully, you will have accumulated the kinds of qualifications you would have needed in any case. I actually think it's worth promoting or endorsing the idea that I think a lot of students could stand to take a bit of time away from academic life before they decide whether they want to pursue postgraduate study or a PhD. I think when you're 20 odd years old and you've been in school for most all of the time that you can remember, imagining a world outside schooling can be difficult, right? And so you might then be attracted, right, to further study because it's familiar, right? It's what you know.
Mm.
But I do think, right, and I've encountered students who've reported this to me, that taking some time off after one's bachelor's degree can help you figure out whether you really can live, right, without being in academic institutions, right, and be happy with it. Right. I think some people discover that they can, right, and that's good in the sense that they didn't make the sort of mistake of kind of rushing into postgraduate study because they kind of couldn't fathom, right, anything else, any other alternative. So I think it's a good idea to take some time. Um, I also think there's a question as you approach it. What are you seeking out, right? So one of the good things I think about the way at least academic philosophy tends to operate in the UK is that typically what people do if they want to get a PhD is they pursue a master's degree, an MSc degree, and typically that's a 1-year degree. And I think the benefit of that is that if you're not sure whether you want an academic career coming out of undergrad, you probably will know after that MSc year, right? You'll have a better sense of whether you have the abilities and the taste and the personality to pursue it. And I think that's an important sort of, kind of way station along the way, right? You kind of stop and ask yourself, well, I wasn't sure, what is my experience as a master's student told me,
Mm.
right, about whether it's good for me to continue.
I think so general advice would be the same. Like I think if everybody just comes straight from high school and then go to university and it's just completely same age group, unlike Germany where you could have different age group that come into the university and you have a conversation across generations and then realize like, oh, I like philosophy, I want to continue. But if you are coming from university, everybody's the same age group and you excelled in that age group as like one of the top students and then you decided to go to master's degree immediately, I find it to be very too specialized. Like you don't really know the world right? The philosophy is ultimately about talking about the meaning of life and the meaning of what's happening in the world. And if you don't really know beyond that little group, it's very difficult to come up with a really good thesis, right? So like you need to come up with the questions that are really meaningful to you, and then that actually propels you to the further academic career. So generally, I recommend students to step out for like 1 year or two and just, pick up some jobs and start to talk with the people and realize like, okay, like I still really want to study philosophy. I can't imagine what it's like to live my life for the rest of my life without doing that, and then come back. Gives you a better feeling than like, because I got first in philosophy, so I'm just going to continue. Usually you get disappointed or started to feel like, this might have nothing to do with the life. But if you actually go out in the world and come back and then realize, okay, this is really important. So in general, I do recommend, but I think the bottom line is that if you can't think about living next year without doing this, like a philosophical discussions in general, I think the grad school, not only in philosophy, but any program whatsoever, I think that's good option. Yeah.
I'm wondering if either of you guys took time out of academia, and if so, how that has benefited, like specific examples of how that has kind of benefited your research or work or just your way of thinking about philosophy.
So I did take a break during the undergraduate. So I went to the university in Japan, and I was just disappointed with the ways in which the Japanese education was set up for the higher education. So out of nowhere, I just told my parents that I'm going to go to Nebraska. That's why I speak really good English, because people couldn't understand the different accents there. I always tell that to my friends from Nebraska. But so that gave me a little bit of gap year, like 1 or 2 years in undergraduate. And then from then on, maybe I took one semester off, and then after PhD, I took like 2 years off, right? After postdoc, there's like a gap in my academic career. I always find those gap years to be really beneficial, because if I didn't know certain things in academia probably could discourage me, then basic example would be like bureaucracy, right? We complain about bureaucracy in academia, but then if you go to bureaucracy in the government sector, that bureaucracy is like 10 times worse, right? And I just realized, okay, this is not as bad. That would be the negative affirmation is great. And the positive one is like, in the certain circumstances, it would be very difficult for me to have in-depth conversation. For instance, one of the job was to sell like beverages to the HoReCa sector, right? Like the conversation is about whether or not you buy this product. There's no depth in this conversation. It's like, here's the product, you taste it, you buy it, and how much do you want, right? And if you do that whole year, you have this like a burden desire to actually have a conversation about, but what do you actually think about life, right? Do you think this is the best way to pursue our time together, right? And that gives me a sense that the academia can provide us a space to actually have an in-depth conversation, like world politics to like life conditions and existential condition. I think that taking a time off gave me perspective to be able to actually reintroduce. I don't think it's necessary. You could actually go through the entire academic career without losing the perspective, but I think many students, it might be actually helpful.
Well, I did not, in my own case, take any gap time between my undergraduate years and my postgraduate years, though I did along the way, explore some other professions. I came into undergraduate years thinking I might pursue journalism. I had sort of some internships in that area. As a PhD student, I did different kinds of jobs. So I think I tried to get some perspective on what the alternatives might be. And I think what Takeshi is saying is exactly right. I actually have a couple of PhD supervisees right now who have come into PhD studies sort of more like in their 30s rather than their 20s, having worked in different industries. And I think that they're particularly strong students because they have a kind of strong and steady motivation, right? That comes from the recognition that they really do want to do this. They just didn't sort of, choose it as the default, right? Because they couldn't think of anything else or nothing else. They didn't have any knowledge of anything else. The other thing I would say is that, the supposition that if you are really engaged by philosophy, right, if you find yourself very passionate about it, that the only way to do that is to make a career out of it. I think that that's something that I would invite people to second guess, to question, right? I think we're in a golden age, in a sense, right, for people who want to informally educate themselves, right, about philosophy, right? There's podcasts, there's, online lectures, there's, a billion things that you can do to learn about what's going on in contemporary philosophy and continue to develop your understanding of philosophical issues. So I think one of the things that students kind of too quickly assume is that if they're going to, continue to learn about philosophy, they have to, make it their professional focus, right? And I think that that's something that students should rethink. It's particularly true if you happen to live, sort of in a large city that's got, a philosophy program at its universities. You can go to the talks. You can do all these sorts of things. And I would really encourage people to do that because, again, I think it's just difficult as an undergraduate to have a very good sense of what it would be like, right? To make academic philosophy a career. Because so much of what we do just isn't visible to you, right? And it's kind of not meant to be visible to you, right? So.
Well, for someone who's in that position who would, not want to do a career in philosophy, but is still very interested, might it still be worth it doing postgraduate studies, master's or PhD even?
It might, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that you're talking about a very significant commitment of time and probably money,
yeah, of course.
Right? So, I think the standard amount, kind of the median time, right, sort of throughout the world that it would take you to get from, bachelor's to PhD in philosophy is somewhere around 5 or 6 years, depending on exactly where you attend and, the structure of your program. So that's not an inconsiderable, time commitment. And you might have the good fortune of having very generous funding for your studies, but you might not. And so, I think people need to be mindful, right, of the opportunity costs, right, of doing this. There are, of course, opportunity costs if you pursue the PhD path and you do go into academia. I think one of the things that the first thing I like to tell students who approach me about PhD studies is, the first question I ask them is, where in the world are you willing to live? Okay, because one of the things you're not going to have at your disposal, almost certainly, is a large set of options about where you're going to live in the world, right? The academic job market is a global market. On the one hand, that's really interesting. A guy like me grew up on the West Coast of the United States, could end up working in Scotland. That's pretty interesting. On the other hand, somebody growing up in Scotland might end up working on the West Coast of the United States. And maybe they're like, oh, shoot, that wasn't what I was hoping for. West Coast is great, mind you. I love it. But you're not probably going to have your choice, right, of where you're going to be working and living. And that means, like on a personal level, you have to imagine, living in a different, region or nation or continent from, your family and, the places you grew up in. That can be a good thing, but, I think it's something that people should have foremost in their minds when they think about this kind of career.
That's the first thing I tell my PhD students the first year when they arrived here. And I just told them that the condition for the possibility of survival in academia is that you have to be able to pack your suitcase tonight, leave tomorrow. It's like a basic Jesuit, 24 hours ahead of time, tell you to move to different dioceses. It's like the Jesuit has a spiritual training to make sure that everything can fit in one suitcase. That's exaggeration, but I do think that it's just not advisable for academic institutions to grow undergraduate, master's, PhD, and then make them tenure. Used to be that in the European academia a lot in many places, and I think some places are still kind of observing a little bit of that tradition. But I think if you enter this international global market, you're competing with one of the top guys from Tokyo, Beijing, Washington, D.C., California, Los Angeles, and then try to make the best program in that global competition. So I don't think it's possible to live where you want to live. It's just we're so fortunate that the Edinburgh is great, right? But I mean, like this should not be the model in which you say, oh, if I study PhD, everybody will be able to work in Edinburgh. I think we need to really get rid of that idea. Other things that I would like to mention about the postgraduate degrees, like if you are in China or United States, if you're interested in philosophy, going to the graduate program is very important because that's where you find the people you can talk about what you're interested in, right? If you're in Nebraska, you better go to graduate school because you're not going to find a Bob down the street that are interested in Plato, right? So like, in terms of creating the community of intellectuals that are interested in the same kind of question, I think that certain areas of the world is actually more important. I do find Europe is a little bit blurry on that regard, because you would find like people are interested in these kind of philosophical questions in public intellectuals. If the population of public intellectuals is large, I don't think you need to go to graduate program to find people you can talk about philosophy. That's what Michael was saying, that you just go to the talks, right? You just go to the talks that University of Edinburgh is actually putting forward. You can go to Glasgow, right? But if you're in Lincoln County, Nebraska, you have to be in the program to be able to actually have that conversation. So, take time off. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are completely cut off from philosophy discussions. And then, you do whatever you want to do for that 1 or 2 years gap year, and then stay in touch with philosophical content. And then you have this desire that I really want to pursue my career. That's usually my recommendation. And then you do have to get rid of this idea that, I can choose wherever I want to go and to stay there. It's most likely that you would have to move around quite a bit. Yeah.
I do think one of the things that you need to be thinking about, for better or for worse, is sort of the prestige hierarchy that exists within our field. It's just true that if you get a job at, I'm just going to pick one institution among several that I might select, Princeton, that you will probably get a pretty good job somewhere in the academic world. Not necessarily, but it'd be surprising if you don't. On the other hand, and this is not to pick on any particular institution, if you were to get a PhD from, I don't know, the University of Washington or the University of Manchester here in the UK, these are places that have excellent scholars and so forth, but it's just the reality that you're going to struggle because, you're just not associated with an institution that has the same level of visibility and prestige. So, I don't like the fact that there is this sort of reality in our field, but it would be a disservice, right, for me to tell a student, just ignore that, right? Because, you'd be doing something very, very foolish if you didn't notice that, for example, having a degree from Oxford, say, tends to go a lot further in terms of enhancing your career prospects than, one from, Cornell or, University of Illinois. Again, not to disparage those institutions. That's not the point. But
descriptively, like
just that's just the reality.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean,
tough message.
Yeah, it really is. So like I struggle with this conflict, right? That if you're interested in a master's degree or PhD, like I always said, go with the supervisor. If you want to study with Michael Cholbi, go to Edinburgh, right?
Well,
but
right,
if you really want to study the grief and philosophy of death and dying, that's the guy you need to go, right? And then you work with the professors that are actually hands-on and actually have a conversation with you at the equal level. But if you're interested in getting a job, go to Oxford, Cambridge, right? Because it has a higher chance of getting the job opportunity. So like there's a practicality of like the basic rule that when you apply, right? I started from Nebraska and ended up in the KU Leuven, right? So you just always have to go up the ladder. You always apply for the program that is ranked higher so that you increase the chance of getting the job. But it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a job, right? So at some point you have to make a decision. So do I want to become academic, playing all these games perfectly to actually survive in academia? Or like, you know what? At some point I just have to draw the line and say, I need to study with one of the best of the best, even though that person doesn't work for the institution that is ranked as one of the best universities. So this example is not working well, but you understand that if you're interested in Italian philosophy, right, you're not going to find in Oxford or Cambridge. You have to go somewhere else, right? So it has to come down to your interest and desire to philosophize. Right?
But it should be said that people get permanent academic posts coming from lots and lots of different PhD programs. It's not that any program has a monopoly on them or anything. I think it's interesting to notice here at Edinburgh the sheer range of different places that people got their PhDs from. It's quite remarkable to notice all the different places that people attended. But a realistic perspective has to include that yes, these things go a long way in determining what kinds of options are available to you. And, kind of bottom line, lots of students get PhDs in philosophy and don't get permanent academic jobs. And so if that's kind of where your heart's desire is, you do have to ask yourself the sort of, alarming or perhaps unsettling question, am I willing to put in, say, 6 years of labor, including all the opportunity costs that might involve, and end up being, 29, 30 years old or something like that, and kind of facing a professional dead end, right? Where you kind of have to then figure out, well, how am I going to, support myself? What's my livelihood going to be if it's not going to be in the academic world? And I think that, you never want to sort of paint the worst case scenario for people, but I do think that students need to be cognizant of that possibility, because it's not like an abstract possibility. It happens to
many of us,
a non-trivial number of people, right, who pursue PhDs.
Can I just ask like a very specific question when you were talking about, the prestige and how kind of the reality is very much like your chances of getting a job from Oxford is way higher than like, I don't know, Manchester. I'll just use your example. In terms of like name brand versus prestige within philosophy, like I know there's kind of this philosophy gourmet rankings of, and they're very specific by philosophical area. I think University of Pittsburgh is one that I've seen that's like ranked very high, but it doesn't have that same name brand as like Oxford or Princeton to people who are outside of the like philosophy academia world. I'm wondering, let's say just hypothetically somebody gets in to like University of Pittsburgh, and University of Pittsburgh is ranked technically the highest on these rankings in the area of philosophy they want, but they also get into, let's say, like Harvard, and maybe Harvard's like 5th in the rankings, but it's got that name. Should you care more about, in terms of the prospects of getting a job, should you care more about the name or like the actual way that the program is regarded in terms of like quote unquote rankings?
It's a really good question.
Well, I think the ultimate answer to that depends on what kind of positions you're hoping to get. So Pittsburgh is a good example. NYU is another. Those are programs that are extremely well regarded within philosophy, but maybe kind of within the overall sort of academic branding universe don't stand on the same par with, Harvard or something like that. So I think what evidence I've seen about this suggests that if you are thinking that you want a job in a PhD granting program, right, that's very sort of research intensive, then I would say that you should opt for, given in your example, say, Pittsburgh over Harvard. If, on the other hand, you're sort of thinking, I'm open to lots and lots of different kinds of positions, some of which might be more teaching focused, for example, if you're in the United States, then I would say probably you should opt for Harvard. And the reason for this is that, the people who make the decisions about who gets which jobs, yes, they're the relevant faculty at those institutions, but they're also administrators, right? And administrators are often perhaps more impressed, right? Because they're not just as up to date or in the know about what's going on in all these different academic disciplines. They're likely to be a little bit more impressed by saying, well, we hired such and such from Harvard, then we hired such and such from Pittsburgh, even though the philosopher might sort of say, well, we like Pittsburgh a little better, maybe, right? So I think it kind of depends on the positions that you're looking for. But again, certainly within philosophy, there are places that, relative to their place within kind of the overall academic universe, punch well above their weight, Pittsburgh and NYU and these other kinds of places. And they certainly, you certainly shouldn't rule those places out, right? Simply by virtue of the fact that, they may not be quite as impressive to a dean or to, somebody who's outside of our profession.
I do think that, general rules that these kind of rankings play a role when there's two candidates is almost identical, right? And then it just feels like the trust goes to the higher brand, right? But the difficulty of going the graduate programs that are actually not ranked high is that you have to really show twice as much. That you have to be able to show that you can pitch twice as much as the other guy that went to one of the top league, right? So when you enter the arena, I think there is a tendency to, expect that, if you didn't go to the top institutions in that area, you have to show us something that, like, wow us, right?
Yeah.
But if you play average, it's very difficult for you to get a job. So that's why I think sometimes it's better to actually go high-ranked university and train yourself there, even if that's not the best place to actually study the topic. So generally, always go up the rank when you apply for the graduate program, and hopefully you can find some professors from that institutions that are interested in the same area as you. So that's the general the advice you give. But if you find one celebrity thinker, the grief, right? Michael Cholbi is on grief. Like, this is the one guy working on this topic in this entire zip code or vicinity of this nation. Just go. Like, I don't care about the ranking. Just learn from that person. And so I tell my students that, hey, you might not be able to actually get a job right after this PhD, but if you follow this program, you'll be one of the few people that can actually work in this area of Japanese philosophy. So you will be established as leading scholar of Japanese philosophy. Whether or not academia can provide you positions to actually feed your family is a whole other set of question, right?
Yeah, I think what I observe is that sort of the more prestigious or more better known a program is, sort of the more candidates are given the benefit of the doubt, right? So
that's
the way to look at it is, the candidate from Oxford, since they were admitted to Oxford, it's presumed that they have philosophical talent, and even if, say, as a PhD student, they didn't publish any articles, it's assumed that they will, right? They just haven't gotten there yet, or something like that. So the benefit of the doubt is extended to them. Whereas if you went to the less prestigious program, you have to have more kind of concrete evidence and accomplishments, right? You have to be able to say, look at what I can do, right? Kind of counteract the sense that, the people from the more prestigious programs, if they don't have that concrete evidence, it's just because it hasn't sort of materialized yet.
And oftentimes it's quite accurate. It's not like complete prejudice. Is that if you go to Harvard and Oxford, send us applications and look at the dossier, and they publish, a few articles, and when you read their work, it's pretty decent. So it's very, very difficult to,
Harvard graduates, not terrible.
Yeah, it's just not
controversial.
Yeah. It's very difficult to find there are exceptions, of course, but it's very difficult to find exceptions, and I think that's what the good recruitment process that university is actually enforcing. So I do. There should be always a benefit of the doubt, and it should measure each individual applicants based on their personal achievement. But if you went to Harvard, like, they would give you a lot of support to make sure that you stay on top, right? Yeah. So that's why I would recommend to just always think about higher ranked university in the area that you're interested in to go there.